A single mother was fired for being late after helping an injured man on the street. It was her millionaire boss. When he discovered the truth, his reaction changed everything forever. A story of kindness and love that will touch your heart. Subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and comment where you are watching from. The rain poured heavily over the streets of New York City on that March Monday, turning the city into a maze of puddles and broken umbrellas. Sarah Johnson, 38, was running down Main Street with her heart racing, not only from the physical exertion, but also from the anxiety that had become her constant companion in recent months. Her brown hair clung to her face, and the navy blue uniform of the medical clinic where she worked was soaked through, revealing her white blouse underneath. "Oh God, I can't be late again," she murmured to herself, checking her cracked phone screen. It was already 7:45 a.m., and her shift started at 8. This was the third time in 2 weeks that her alarm had failed to go off properly, or perhaps it was just her, too exhausted to even hear it anymore. She had been working as a receptionist at the City Medical Center for 5 years, a mid-sized establishment that catered to both insurance and private clients in the central area of the city. Sarah was the type of woman who carried the weight of the world on her shoulders without letting anyone notice. Her green eyes, despite the constant fatigue, still sparkled with an unwavering determination she had inherited from her mother, a woman who had raised 5 children alone in rural Pennsylvania. Her hands, always careful and precise, a legacy of her 10 years of experience as a nursing technician before accepting the administrative job, trembled slightly as she adjusted her bag on her shoulder. The career change had not been by choice. After a turbulent divorce from Robert 3 years prior, she had to take any job that allowed for more flexible hours to care for her children. Lucas, 16, a bright but introverted teenager who dreamed of studying medicine, and Isabella, 14, outgoing and dreamy, passionate about dance and social media. The $2,800 monthly salary barely covered the family's basic needs, especially after Robert simply disappeared, leaving behind only broken promises and child support that rarely arrived. "Damn it, damn it, damn it," she repeated, trying to shield herself from the rain with a magazine she found at the bus stop. The 2-bedroom apartment in Maplewood, where they had lived for 8 years, was becoming increasingly burdensome on the budget. The rent had gone up, the children's school was pressuring for supplies she couldn't afford, and the utility bills seemed to grow exponentially each month. It was then that she saw him. A few meters from the entrance of the clinic, a man lay on the wet sidewalk. He was wearing a perfectly tailored grey suit, even soaked by the rain, and a dark blue tie that contrasted with the alarming pallor of his face. His greying hair was plastered to his forehead, and his breathing was irregular, almost imperceptible. He appeared to be around 50, with striking features that denoted authority, even in that vulnerable state. Sarah stopped instantly. Her medical training took precedence over any hurry or personal concern. She dropped her bag on the ground and knelt beside the stranger, not caring about the dirty water from the gutter soaking her knees. Sir, can you hear me?" she called, immediately checking his pulse at his neck. Weak and irregular. Her decade of experience in healthcare made her recognize the signs immediately. Heart attack. The movement around her seemed to slow down. People hurried past, some glancing sideways, others pretending not to see. 1 or 2 stopped for a few seconds, but quickly went on their way, probably thinking someone else was already taking care of the situation. Sarah knew she couldn't rely on the kindness of others at that moment. "Can someone help me?" "Call EMS," she shouted to the passers-by as she began first aid procedures. She loosened the man's tie and unbuttoned the top buttons of his shirt to allow for better circulation. Her hands worked with mechanical precision, a product of years of experience and training. The man murmured something incomprehensible, his lips taking on a concerning bluish hue. Sarah placed her hands on his chest and began chest compressions, mentally counting the correct rhythm she had practiced hundreds of times during her training. 1, 2, 3, 4, she counted softly, pressing firmly on the stranger's chest. The wet suit made the procedure difficult, but she didn't stop. Between sequences of compressions, she checked his pulse and breathing again. "Ma'am, what happened?" asked a voice behind her. It was a young man of about 20, holding an umbrella and looking worried. "Heart attack." "Have you called EMS?" Sarah replied without interrupting her procedures. "I'm calling now." The young man quickly dialed 911, describing the situation and the exact address. Sarah glanced quickly at her watch. It was already 8:15. She was officially late, but at that moment, it didn't matter. A human life was literally in her hands. She remembered her nursing instructor's words from years ago. "Sarah, you were born to care for people. This is your truest calling." The rain continued to fall, but it seemed to have lessened in intensity. Or perhaps it was just her perception, completely focused on the man in front of her. He opened his eyes for a brief moment, blue eyes that looked at her with a mix of confusion and gratitude before closing them again. It's okay, Sarah whispered, as if speaking to one of her children after a nightmare. "You're going to be okay. Help is on the way." The sound of the EMS siren finally echoed through the busy streets of the central area. Sarah felt an immense relief wash over her chest. She continued with the procedures until the paramedics arrived and took over the situation. They praised her for the speed and precision of her first aid, confirming that her actions had likely saved the man's life. As she stood up, wiping her hands on her already muddy clothes, she realized that more than an hour had passed. It was almost 9:30 in the morning. Her stomach tightened with anxiety. 2 warnings were already on her record at the city medical center. A third would result in immediate termination. She picked up her bag from the floor, now also soaked, and ran toward the entrance of the clinic. Her footsteps echoed on the wet floor of the lobby, and she tried to compose herself quickly before facing what she knew awaited her. Dr. Henry Smith, the administrative supervisor, was waiting for her at the reception with an expression that left no doubt about his irritation. Dr. Henry Smith was a man who had turned ambition into a dark art. At 45 years old, his impeccable appearance, hair always perfectly styled with gel, expensive suits, and polished shoes, contrasted with the calculating coldness of his brown eyes. He had joined the City Medical Center 2 years ago, brought in by the board to modernize administrative processes and increase the company's profitability. For Henry, numbers mattered more than people, and efficiency was synonymous with the elimination of problematic elements. Sarah crossed the clinic's entrance hall with her heart racing. The environment she knew so well, white walls adorned with landscape paintings, blue chairs for patients, and the characteristic smell of disinfectant mixed with coffee, felt different that morning. More hostile, more threatening. The other staff members looked at her with a mix of pity and curiosity, whispering among themselves while pretending to organize patient files. "Sarah Johnson." Henry's voice cut through the air like a sharp blade. "My office, now." She took a deep breath, adjusted her still damp hair, and followed the supervisor to the administrative office. Henry's office was a reflection of his personality, organized to the point of obsession, with shelves filled with management manuals, framed diplomas on the walls, and a glass desk where not a single pen was out of place. The only personal decoration was a photo of him receiving a Manager of the Year award at some corporate event. "Sit down," he ordered, pointing to the plastic chair in front of the desk, a deliberately uncomfortable choice for disciplinary meetings. Sarah complied, feeling the wet fabric stick unpleasantly to her skin. Her hands trembled slightly, not only from the cold, but from the tension of the moment she knew was coming. 2 hours and 30 minutes late, Henry began, consulting a printed report. Not to mention the 15 minutes from last Monday and the 22 minutes from the previous Thursday. "Do you have any explanation for this unacceptable behavior?" "Dr. Henry, I can explain," Sarah started, trying to keep her voice steady. "On my way to work, I found a man having a heart attack on the street, and you decided to play doctor?" He interrupted her with a sarcastic smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Sarah, you're a receptionist. Your job is to arrive on time and answer phones, not to run out trying to save the world. I am a certified nursing technician, she retorted, feeling her blood boil. I have 10 years of experience in the field. I couldn't just let the man die on the sidewalk. Henry leaned back in his executive chair, intertwining his fingers on the desk. His eyes sparkled with a calculated cruelty that Sarah had never seen before, but that other staff members were already well acquainted with. "Ah, yes, your famous nursing experience," he said, flipping through a folder of documents. "The same experience you abandoned to take an easier job here, right? Let me see. Lower salary, less responsibility, business hours to take care of the kids." Sarah felt as if she had been punched in the stomach. Henry was deliberately humiliating her, touching on wounds he knew were sensitive. She thought of Lucas and Isabella, probably still sleeping at that moment, unaware that the family's livelihood was being threatened. "My personal life has nothing to do with my professional performance," she said, trying to maintain her dignity. "And what happened today was an emergency situation. A human life was at risk. A human life," Henry repeated mockingly. How romantic, how heroic, how completely irrelevant to this company. He stood up and walked to the window, observing the street below. "Sarah, you have already received 2 official warnings for punctuality. This clinic sees 200 patients a day. Every minute of delay represents financial loss and disorganization of the schedule. I understand that, Dr. Henry, but there is no but that justifies it," he cut her off again, turning to face her. "Do you want to know the truth? For months, I've been receiving reports about your conduct. Personal conversations during work hours, using the clinic's phone for personal matters, leaving early, claiming problems with the kids." Sarah stood up, indignant. "That's a lie. I never—" "Are you questioning my word?" Henry's voice rose dangerously. "Are you suggesting that I'm making up this information?" In fact, Henry was indeed inventing much of the accusations. In recent months, he had decided that Sarah represented everything he detested in employees: excessively human, emotionally invested in her work, and worse, respected by her colleagues. Her popularity among co-workers and her natural competence threatened the atmosphere of fear and control he had carefully cultivated at the clinic. "Dr. Henry," Sarah's voice came out softer now, but laden with a dignity that the situation could not break. "I have worked here for 5 years. My record speaks for itself. I have never had a single complaint from patients. I have always been punctual until the recent personal issues I am facing, and none of that matters now." He interrupted her for the last time. He returned to the desk and picked up a letterhead sheet. "Termination for cause. A serious misconduct at work without a plausible justification. Recurrence of tardiness. After." In formal advertisements, Sarah's world seemed to crumble in that moment. Just cause meant not only losing her job, but also not being entitled to unemployment insurance, notice pay, or access to her retirement fund. It meant explaining to future employers why she had been dismissed in such a manner. It meant going home and telling Luke and Isabella that she didn't know how she would pay the bills for the next month. "This is unfair," she murmured, feeling the tears sting her eyes. "I saved a person's life this morning. I did what any decent human being would do." Henry signed the document with a golden pen, his movements deliberately slow and theatrical. "You know what your problem is, Sarah. You confuse work with a missionary vocation. This is a company, not a charity." He extended the paper to her, but Sarah made no move to take it. Her hands remained firmly in her lap, despite all the internal despair she felt. "You can leave it on the table," she said, her voice surprising both of them with its firmness. "I will collect my things at the reception. Before you leave," Henry added with a cruel smile, "let me give you some free advice. Next time you're looking for a job, remember, employers want employees, not heroes." Sarah slowly stood up, smoothing her wet skirt and walking towards the door. Before leaving, she turned to face him one last time. "Dr. Henry," she said, her voice echoing through the room, "you may dismiss my position, but you cannot dismiss my character. And someday, when you need help, I hope you find someone with more humanity than you have shown today." And with those words, she left the room, leaving Henry alone with his empty victory and the sound of the rain continuing to fall outside. 8 weeks had passed since that rainy morning that changed 2 lives forever. At City Hospital, in the 8th floor ICU, Edward Miller was finally beginning to emerge from the induced coma that the doctors had deemed necessary after his emergency heart surgery. The machines around his bed emitted constant beeps, monitoring every heartbeat, every breath, every vital sign, confirming his slow but progressive recovery. Edward was a man accustomed to absolute control. At 52, he had built an empire in the healthcare sector that included a network of private hospitals, specialized clinics, and clinical laboratories spread across 3 states. His personal history was marked by a fierce determination to overcome the limitations of a poor childhood in rural Virginia, where he had been raised solely by his grandmother after his parents died in a car accident when he was just 7 years old. The wealth he had accumulated over 30 years of tireless work, however, had not filled the emotional void left by a failed marriage and the absence of genuine relationships in his life. Mary, his ex-wife, had left him 3 years earlier, claiming he was married to his work and incapable of showing true affection. The accusation had hurt more than Edward admitted, especially because he knew she was right. "Mr. Miller, can you hear me?" The soft voice of Nurse Patricia brought him back to reality. She was an experienced woman around 50 who had worked in the ICU for over 2 decades and had seen countless patients fight between life and death. Edward tried to speak, but his throat was dry and irritated from the breathing tube that had been removed only a few hours earlier. He nodded slightly, feeling as if he were emerging from a very long and confusing nightmare. "That's good," Patricia smiled, adjusting the head of the bed to make him more comfortable. "You gave us quite a scare. 8 weeks asleep, but the doctors assure us that your recovery will be complete. 8 weeks. The information hit Edward like an electric shock. 2 whole months of his life had simply vanished. He tried to remember the last events before losing consciousness, but the images came fragmented, like pieces of a puzzle scattered in his mind. The woman," he managed to murmur with difficulty. "There was a woman," Patricia furrowed her brow, not immediately understanding what he was referring to. "What woman, Mr. Miller? Your ex-wife was here a few times in the early weeks, but—" "No," he shook his head weakly. "On the street. She helped me." Brown hair, blue uniform. The images began to sharpen. A woman kneeling beside him on the wet sidewalk, her hands firm and careful, her soothing voice saying that everything would be all right. The nurse looked at him with renewed curiosity. In the early days after the surgery, when Edward was still sedated, but occasionally murmured incomprehensible things, she had heard fragments that seemed to reference a woman. The doctors had attributed it to the effects of the medications, but now she realized it might be something more. "Let me call Dr. Carter," Patricia said. "He can explain better what happened the day you were found." Dr. Robert Carter was the cardiologist responsible for Edward's case. A meticulous man in his 60s, he had built his reputation by being straightforward and honest with his patients, even when the news was not good. He arrived at the room 15 minutes later, carrying the medical chart and a look of professional satisfaction. "Edward, what a joy to see you awake and aware," the doctor greeted, quickly checking the monitors. "How are you feeling?" "Confused," Edward admitted, his voice still hoarse. "I need to understand what happened. There was a woman on the street. She helped me." Dr. Carter pulled up a chair and sat beside the bed. "Yes, the paramedics mentioned that in the report. When they arrived at the scene, a woman was performing CPR on you. Apparently, she knew exactly what to do, and her actions were crucial in keeping you alive until the ambulance arrived." Edward closed his eyes, trying to reconstruct those final moments before he fainted. He remembered. Edward Miller felt a sudden pain in his chest while walking to an important meeting downtown. He remembered falling, the cold rain on his face, the sensation that he was dying. And then, like an angel appearing amid the chaos, that woman. "Do you know who she was?" Edward asked, opening his eyes again. "Unfortunately, no," replied the doctor. "When the paramedics took over, she simply vanished. They said she seemed to be in a hurry, probably to get to work. It's a shame, because we would have liked to thank her formally. Not many people would have the knowledge and courage to do what she did." Edward remained silent for a few minutes, absorbing the information. A stranger had risked her own well-being to save him, and he didn't even know her name. The feeling was completely new to him, being indebted to someone in a way that money could not repay. "Doctor," Edward finally said, "I need to find her." Dr. Carter raised his eyebrows. "Edward, I understand your gratitude, but this could be very difficult. The city has over 12 million residents. Without any information beyond a physical description—" "I have resources," Edward interrupted. And for the first time since waking up, his voice carried a bit of the determination that had built his empire. "Security cameras, private investigators, contacts in the police. I will find her." In the following weeks, still recovering in the hospital, Edward began his obsessive search. He hired a private investigation firm specializing in complex cases, led by a former police detective named Marcus Anthony. Together, they scoured security footage from businesses in the area where the incident occurred. The process was tedious and frustrating. The city was a place where millions of people passed through daily, and identifying a specific woman based solely on a physical description seemed an impossible task. But Edward was not one to give up easily. That stubborn persistence was precisely what had transformed a poor boy into a millionaire businessman. "Mr. Miller," Marcus Anthony said during one of his visits to the hospital, 3 weeks after Edward had woken from the coma, "we managed to get some interesting footage from a convenience store camera on Augusta Street. There's a woman matching the description, wearing medical scrubs, running toward the location where you were found, exactly at the estimated time of the incident." Edward studied the printed images with the intensity of someone analyzing a $1 million contract. The quality was not perfect, but he could clearly see a brown-haired woman running in the rain, carrying a bag, with a look of urgency on her face. Something in her posture, in the determination of her movements, sparked a strange familiarity. "It's her," Edward murmured, feeling his heart race, a sensation that made him smile ironically, considering his cardiac condition. "I'm sure. It's her." Marcus Anthony nodded in approval. "We managed to trace her path through other cameras. It seems she worked at some medical facility in the downtown area. We're checking clinics and hospitals that require that type of uniform." Edward held the photo with hands that still trembled slightly due to medication. For the first time in his adult life, he felt moved by something beyond financial or professional ambition. It was gratitude, certainly, but there was something deeper, an almost desperate need to connect with someone who had shown genuine kindness without expecting anything in return. This unknown woman had done something that no one in his life had done before. She had risked something important: her job, her punctuality, her own safety, to help him, without even knowing who he was or if he could repay the favor. And Edward Miller was determined to find her, even if it was the last thing he did in his life. Sarah Johnson woke up every day at 5 in the morning, even without a job to go to. The habit of 2 decades of working had become an automatic reflex, but now those extra hours of wakefulness only served to amplify her anxiety. Sitting at the small kitchen table in her apartment in Maplewood, with a cup of watered-down coffee, she had reduced the amount of grounds to make the package last longer. Sarah organized and reorganized the bills that piled up like an unrelenting avalanche. The apartment that had once been her refuge had become a constant source of pressure. 2 bedrooms, a living room, a kitchen, and a bathroom spread over 600 square feet that cost $350 in rent, plus $60 in utilities. Prices that seemed reasonable when she had a steady salary, but had now become an insurmountable mountain. Her savings, the meager $240 she had managed to save over 2 years of sacrifices, had evaporated in the first month, after her layoff. "Mom, is there milk for the cereal?" Isabella asked, appearing in the kitchen still in her pajamas, with messy curly hair and sleepy eyes. At 14, she still did not fully understand the gravity of the family's financial situation. Although she was starting to notice the small signs, less frequent trips to the supermarket, the refusals when she asked for money to go to the movies with friends, the constant tension on her mother's face. "Of course, my love," Sarah lied, serving her daughter the little that remained in the box. She herself would only have black coffee, claiming she was trying to lose weight, another lie to mask the reality that she needed to save every penny. Luke appeared next, already dressed in his school uniform. The eldest son had noticed the difficulties they were facing much more quickly. In recent days, Sarah had caught him searching for part-time job openings online, and the discovery had broken her heart. At 16, he should be worried only about studies, friends, and the normal dreams of adolescence, not about supporting the family. "Mom, I found some apprentice positions I can try for," Luke said, avoiding looking directly at her. "It's only 4 hours a day, it won't." Marina felt a lump in her throat. "Luke, my son, you don't need to—" "I do," he interrupted her, his voice carrying a maturity that shouldn't exist in a teenager. "We are a family. I have responsibilities too." At that moment the phone rang. Marina looked at the display and recognized the number. It was from the children's school, probably calling about the overdue tuition. She let it ring until it went to voicemail, just as she had done for the past 3 days. After Luke and Isabella left for school, Marina prepared for another day of job hunting. She had created a meticulous spreadsheet with all the clinics, hospitals and medical offices in Springfield, marking those where she had already submitted her resume, those awaiting a response, and those where she still needed to try. The problem was that the termination for cause on her employment record acted like a scarlet letter. Most employers didn't even bother to listen to her explanations. Her first stop of the day would be at Maplewood Medical Center. The bus fare cost $3 round trip, an amount she calculated carefully each time she went out. As the bus slowly navigated through the morning traffic of Springfield, Marina watched through the window as people hurried to their jobs, carrying their organized and predictable lives, and felt a painful envy for that normalcy she had lost. Maplewood Medical Center was a modern establishment with a glass facade and a reception area that looked more like a 5-star hotel lobby. Marina adjusted the navy blazer she had bought on sale 2 years ago, her interview outfit, checked for loose threads or stains, and entered with all the confidence she could muster. Chatte de Chi. "Good morning," greeted the receptionist, a young blonde woman in her 20s wearing a pristine uniform and smiling with a studied professional friendliness. "How can I help you?" "Yes, please. I would like to leave my resume for any openings in the administrative or nursing areas," Marina said, extending a folder with organized copies of her documents. The receptionist quickly flipped through the resume, her eyes stopping at the section on professional experience. "I see you worked at City Medical Center. Why did you leave?" It was the question Marina feared the most, but for which she had rehearsed a carefully crafted response. "There was an administrative restructuring, and my position was eliminated," she explained, trying to keep her voice steady. "I understand," said the receptionist, but her tone had subtly changed. "I will add your resume to our database. If a position compatible with your profile opens up, we will contact you." Marina knew that "we will contact you" was a polite way of dismissing her. But she thanked her anyway and left the clinic with the familiar feeling of another door closing in her face. The next 3 stops were variations on the same theme: polite smiles, empty promises of follow-up, and the growing certainty that her professional reputation had been irreparably tarnished by her dismissal from City Medical Center. During lunch, a natural sandwich for $2 bought at a bakery, Marina did the math on a napkin. With the money left in her checking account, she could cover 2 more weeks of basic expenses. After that, she would need to make drastic decisions. The afternoon was nearly over when she arrived at her last stop, a small dental office in downtown Springfield. The place was much more modest than the previous ones, but Marina had learned that sometimes opportunities arose exactly where you least expected them. Dr. Henry Parker, the dentist owner, was a middle-aged man with delicate hands and a genuine smile that contrasted with the artificiality Marina had encountered throughout the day. He welcomed her personally, offered her a chair in his own office, and showed real interest in her experience. "Marina, I'll be frank with you," Dr. Parker said after carefully reviewing her resume. "My current receptionist is leaving at the end of the month because she's moving to the countryside. The salary I can offer is $2,200, much less than you earned before, but it's a calm and family-oriented work environment." Marina felt her heart race. It wasn't ideal, but it was a real opportunity. "Dr. Parker, I accept. When can I start?" "Well," he hesitated for a moment, "there's just one question. I will need references from your last job. It's standard procedure, you understand." And once again, Marina found herself trapped in the snare created by the vengeance of Henry Smith. She knew that any contact with City Medical Center would result in negative comments that would eliminate any chance of getting the position. "Of course, I completely understand," she said, maintaining her smile even as she felt the world crumbling around her again. "I will arrange the references and get back to you tomorrow." Walking back to the bus stop, Marina finally allowed the tears to roll down her face. The injustice of the situation consumed her. She had saved a life, demonstrated the noblest values of humanity, and was being punished as if she were a criminal. That night, after Luke and Isabella went to bed, Marina sat down at the kitchen table and made a decision she knew was inevitable. She picked up the phone and dialed her sister Carla's number in Springfield. "Carla," she said when her sister answered, "I need to talk to you about something important." The conversation was difficult but necessary. Carla, married with 2 small children, immediately offered the guest room in her home. It wouldn't be comfortable, 5 people sharing a space designed for 3, but it would be temporary, just until Marina could get back on her feet. As she organized the documents to begin the process of terminating her lease, Marina looked around the apartment that had been her home for 8 years. Every corner held memories. Luke taking his first steps in the living room, Isabella rehearsing dance routines in her room, movie nights. Sarah Johnson thought about weekends, birthday celebrations, dreams and plans that now seemed to belong to another life. But she was a survivor. She had overcome a traumatic divorce, raised 2 children on her own, and built a career from scratch. Neither Henry Smith nor the circumstances would bring her down for good. "This is just temporary," she whispered to herself, turning off the lights in her apartment. "We will make it. We always do." And with that silent determination burning in her chest, she prepared for another night of restless sleep, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges, but also new possibilities. Mark Anthony knocked on the door of the VIP room at City Hospital at 3 in the afternoon on a sunny Thursday, carrying a brown folder that contained the results of 3 weeks of intensive investigation. Edward, who had already been discharged but preferred to conduct his most important business in the hospital environment, an irony that did not go unnoticed by him, was sitting in a leather chair by the window, reviewing financial reports for his network of hospitals. "Mr. Miller," the investigator said with a professional smile, "we found her." Edward immediately dropped the papers and turned to Mark Anthony with an intensity that surprised them both. Over the past few weeks, as his physical strength returned, his obsession with finding the mysterious woman had grown proportionately. It was not just gratitude. He had begun to realize that it was something much more complex and disturbing. "Sarah Johnson," Mark Anthony continued, opening the folder and spreading photographs and documents across the coffee table. 38 years old, nursing technician, graduated from St. Camillus University, worked for 10 years in public hospitals before accepting an administrative position at City Medical Center. Divorced, 2 teenage children, Luke, 16, and Isabella, 14. Edward studied the photographs with growing fascination. They were images discreetly captured in recent days. Sarah leaving job interviews, walking through downtown streets waiting for buses, always with that same determined expression he vaguely remembered from the morning of the accident. Even in the photos where she looked tired or worried, there was something in her posture that conveyed an unshakable inner strength. "Where does she work now?" Edward asked. Mark Anthony's expression grew darker. "Now that's the interesting part of the story, Mr. Miller. She was fired from City Medical Center on the same day she saved you, for just cause, citing tardiness." Edward raised his eyebrows, feeling a strange indignation forming in his chest. "She was fired because she helped me." "Exactly. She arrived 2 hours late because she stopped to give first aid to you. The administrative supervisor, a certain Dr. Henry Smith, did not accept her explanations and summarily dismissed her." Mark Anthony flipped through some pages of his report. "Since then, she has been unemployed. From what we could gather, the just cause dismissal is making it very difficult for her to find a new job." The information hit Edward like a punch in the stomach. A wave of guilt and responsibility washed over him, completely unexpectedly. This woman had literally sacrificed her livelihood to save him, and he hadn't even known it until that moment. "What is her current situation?" he asked, his voice now lower. "Difficult," Mark Anthony admitted. "She had to leave the apartment where she lived in Maplewood because she couldn't pay the rent. She moved in with her sister in Springfield 2 weeks ago with her children. She continues to look for jobs daily, but without success." Edward stood up and walked to the window, observing the intense movement of Main Street below. Millions of people struggling to survive, build their lives, support their families. And one of them had lost everything for showing compassion for him. "I want to meet her," he finally said. "Mr. Miller," Mark Anthony hesitated, "may I suggest caution in your approach? From our investigation, she's a person of very strong principles. A very direct approach, or one that seems, well, self-serving, may not yield the result you expect." Edward turned to face him. "What do you mean?" "I mean that offering money directly, or expensive gifts, or anything that might sound like a reward for a good deed, will likely be rejected. She has a history of independence and strong personal pride. Even during her divorce, she refused to accept a higher alimony from her ex-husband, preferring to build her own financial stability." Edward absorbed the information in silence. He was used to solving problems with money, buying solutions, using his financial power as a tool to get what he wanted. But this situation required a completely different approach. "Where can I find her?" he asked. Mark Anthony consulted his notes. "Tomorrow morning, she has an interview scheduled at New Life Clinic in the Liberty area. After that, she usually has lunch at a cheap diner near Central Square before continuing her job search in the downtown area." Edward spent the rest of the day carefully planning his first meeting with Sarah. He couldn't just show up and introduce himself. That would be too shocking and could scare her away. He needed a more subtle, more natural approach. The next morning, deliberately dressed more casually, jeans, a dress shirt without a tie, and a simple blazer, Edward strategically positioned himself in a cafe near New Life Clinic. At 10:30, he saw Sarah exit the building with a familiar expression of barely concealed frustration. Even from a distance, he could tell that the interview had not gone well. He discreetly followed her through the busy downtown streets, keeping a safe distance. Sarah walked for 15 minutes until she reached the diner that Mark Anthony had mentioned, a simple establishment called Home Flavor, with formica tables and a menu, handwritten on a chalkboard hanging on the wall. Edward waited 5 minutes before entering. The place was moderately busy, with workers from the area quickly grabbing lunch before returning to their jobs. Sarah was sitting alone at a corner table, eating a sandwich. Marina was sitting in a cafe, flipping through job classifieds in a newspaper. He approached the counter, ordered a coffee and a cinnamon roll, and then, as if it were a natural coincidence, looked around for a place to sit. His eyes found Sarah's by chance. For a moment, they stared at each other in silence. Luke saw a flicker of recognition in her green eyes, immediately followed by confusion. Sarah, in turn, felt the strange sensation of knowing that man from somewhere, but she couldn't pinpoint where or when. "Excuse me," said Luke, approaching her table with what he hoped was a natural smile. "There are no empty seats here. Would it be possible to share the table?" Sarah looked around the cafe and noticed that there were indeed no other available tables. "Sure," she replied, moving the newspaper to make more space. Luke sat down, trying to control the anxiety he felt. He was finally in the presence of the woman who had become a silent obsession over the past few weeks. Up close, she was even more impressive than in the photographs. There was a natural elegance in her movements, even dressed in simple clothes, and her eyes carried a depth that suggested significant life experiences. "Looking for a job?" he asked, making a discreet gesture towards the newspaper. Sarah nodded, a bit embarrassed. "Yes, the job market is quite tough. May I ask what field you work in?" "Healthcare," she replied. "I have a nursing background, but I also have administrative experience in clinics and hospitals." Luke took a sip of coffee, carefully choosing his next words. "Funny, I also work in healthcare. Maybe I can help with some leads." Sarah studied him more closely now. There was something familiar about that face, that voice, an uncomfortable sensation of déjà vu that she couldn't identify. "That would be very kind," she said, "but I don't want to bother you." "Bother? Not at all." Luke smiled, and for the first time in weeks, the smile was genuine. "In fact, I think sometimes destiny puts the right people in our path exactly when we need them." Sarah slightly furrowed her brow. There was something in the way he said those words that triggered a distant memory, like an echo of a conversation she couldn't locate. "Sorry for the question," she finally said, "but have we met somewhere before? I have the impression that I've seen you before." Luke felt his heart race. This was the crucial moment. He could lie, maintain the disguise longer, or he could start to reveal the truth gradually. "You know," he said, choosing a middle ground, "I also have that feeling. Maybe we crossed paths in some hospital or clinic around here." It was technically true, he thought. They had indeed crossed paths that rainy morning, even if she didn't remember the details. Sarah nodded, seemingly satisfied with the explanation. "That must be it. Springfield is a big city, but the healthcare field is a relatively small community." They talked for another 20 minutes about small talk. The city's traffic, the difficulty of finding good jobs, the transformations in the healthcare system. Luke found out that Sarah was exactly as he had imagined. Intelligent, articulate, with strong opinions, but expressed with elegance, and above all, genuinely concerned about people's well-being. When she stood up to leave, Luke gathered the courage to take the next step. "Sarah," he said, and she turned, surprised that he knew her name. Luke realized his mistake immediately. "Sorry, you mentioned your name during our conversation." She hadn't mentioned it, and they both knew that. Sarah looked at him with renewed suspicion, but said nothing. "I was thinking," Luke continued quickly, "I know some places in the South Side that might be hiring. If you want, I can make some calls." Sarah hesitated. There was something strange about that encounter. That man who knew her name and seemed overly interested in helping her. But the desperate need to find a job spoke louder than caution. "That would be very kind of you," she finally said. "But I don't even know your name." "Luke," he replied, extending his hand. "Luke Miller." And when their hands touched in that simple greeting, both felt a strange electric current, as if the universe was confirming that this meeting was much more significant than either of them imagined. 3 weeks had passed since the meeting at the cafe, and Sarah's life had taken a completely unexpected turn. Luke had kept his promise to make some calls, and she was now working as a patient care supervisor at Hope Clinic, a modern establishment located in Springfield, just 20 minutes from her sister Carla's house. The salary of $3 was better than anything she had found in months of searching, and for the first time since her layoff, Sarah began to glimpse the possibility of rebuilding her financial independence. The clinic was a welcoming environment, with walls painted in soft shades of green and blue, ornamental plants scattered throughout the hallways, and a small but dedicated team. Sarah had quickly adapted to the administrative routines, applying her nursing experience to improve patient care protocols. Her direct supervisor, Dr. Patricia Adams, was a family physician in her 50s who appreciated Sarah's competence and dedication. What Sarah didn't know was that Hope Clinic had been acquired by Luke just a week before he offered her the position. The transaction, conducted through a complex network of intermediary companies, had cost $2.3 million, an amount Luke considered a modest investment to be close to the woman who had become his silent obsession. On that Friday morning, Sarah was organizing the patient records for the day when Dr. Patricia approached with a mysterious smile. "Sarah, I need to let you know that we will have a special visitor today," the doctor said. "The new owner of the clinic is coming by to meet the staff and see the facilities." Sarah looked up from the documents. "Oh, that's great. I hope he will be satisfied with the work we are doing." "I'm sure he will be," Dr. Patricia replied with a tone that Sarah couldn't fully decipher. "He'll arrive around 2 in the afternoon." The day continued its normal routine until, promptly at 2 p.m., Sarah heard familiar voices coming from the reception. When she looked up, she saw Edward Miller entering the clinic, accompanied by a man in a suit who seemed to be a lawyer or accountant. Her first thought was one of pleasant surprise. Perhaps he was there as a patient or visiting someone. "Edward," she greeted, genuinely smiling. "What a coincidence to see you here." Edward approached, and Sarah noticed something strange in his expression, a mix of nervousness and determination that didn't match the confident man she had met at the cafe. "Sarah," he said, his voice more formal than usual. "Actually, it's not really a coincidence." Dr. Patricia joined them at that moment, and Sarah realized there was something rehearsed in the way the doctor positioned herself next to Edward. "Sarah," Dr. Patricia said, "I would like to introduce you to Edward Miller, the new owner of the Hope Clinic." Sarah's world seemed to stop for a moment. She looked from Edward to Dr. Patricia, trying to process the information she had just received. The man she had coincidentally met at the cafe, who had kindly offered help to find a job, was actually the owner of the clinic where she worked. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice coming out lower than she intended. Edward took a deep breath. He had rehearsed that moment dozens of times, but now that it was happening, all the carefully chosen words seemed inadequate. "Sarah, I can explain," he began. "Explain what exactly?" Sarah's voice was rising, and some staff members began to discreetly look in their direction. "Explain how you lied to me from the very first moment. Explain how you manipulated me into accepting this job." "It wasn't manipulation," Edward tried to argue. "I really wanted to help you." "Help?" Sarah laughed, but it was a laugh devoid of humor. "You used me, made me believe I was getting this job on my own merit, when in fact it was just, what, charity? Pity?" Dr. Patricia tried to intervene. "Sarah, maybe you two should talk privately." "No." Sarah interrupted her, her indignation growing by the second. "I want to understand now. Edward, who are you really? Why did you do this?" Edward looked around, noticing that the situation was attracting more attention than he desired. "Sarah, please, let's go somewhere more private. I promise I will explain everything." Sarah hesitated for a moment, but her need for answers spoke louder. She followed him to the main office of the clinic, closing the door behind her with more force than necessary. The office smelled of eucalyptus due to an essential oil diffuser that Dr. Patricia always kept on. The walls were decorated with medical diplomas and photographs of soothing landscapes, but the atmosphere at that moment was charged with tension. "Start talking," Sarah said, crossing her arms and positioning herself as far away from him as possible. Edward leaned against the desk, running his hands through his hair, a nervous gesture Sarah had never seen before. "My name really is Edward Miller," he began, "and I really work in healthcare. I own a network of hospitals and clinics in Chicago, Los Angeles, and Texas." Sarah felt as if she had been punched in the stomach. A millionaire businessman? That explained the expensive clothes she had noticed, the natural confidence in his movements, the way he spoke about business. "Continue," she said, her voice more controlled now but icy. 2 months ago, I had a heart attack on the street, Edward continued, watching her reaction closely. A woman found me collapsed on the sidewalk and saved my life, performing first aid until the ambulance arrived. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Fragmented memories began to form in her mind. A man in a grey suit, rain, chest compressions. That woman, Edward continued, taking a step toward her, disappeared before I could thank her. I spent weeks looking for her until I finally managed to find her. No, Sarah whispered, shaking her head slowly. It can't be. You saved my life, Sarah, Edward said, his voice heavy with genuine emotion. And when I found out you had been fired because of that you were struggling financially for helping me, I couldn't just do nothing. Sarah sat heavily in the chair meant for patients, her legs suddenly unable to support her. The pieces of the puzzle finally fell into place. The feeling of familiarity, his medical knowledge, the excessive interest in helping her. You deceived me, she finally said, her voice almost a whisper. From the very first moment you deceived me. I didn't want to deceive you. Edward moved closer, kneeling beside her chair. I wanted to get to know you. I wanted to understand what kind of person would risk everything to save a stranger. And the more I got to know you, the more I realized that what? Aunt Sarah stared at him with tears in her eyes. That you are the most extraordinary person I have ever met, he said, his voice low and intense. That for the first time in my life, I found someone who acts out of genuine kindness, expecting nothing in return. Sarah abruptly stood up, stepping away from him. No, you don't understand anything. I lost my job because of that day. I'd lost my apartment, my independence. I almost lost my dignity. My children had to leave the school they attended. We had to move to my sister's house. And that's why I wanted to compensate you. Edward stood up as well. You sacrificed everything to save me. The least I could do was ensure you regained your stability. Ensure? Sarah laughed bitterly. You guaranteed nothing. You gave me an illusion. Made me believe I was rebuilding my life on my own merit when it was just a puppet in your private gratitude show. Edward felt as if each of her words was a stab. That's not true, Sarah. You earned this job. Your competence, your dedication, earned. She interrupted him. How can I have earned a job that you specifically created for me? How can I trust anything you say now? That's... The silence that followed was filled only with the distant sound of traffic and the low hum of the air conditioning. Edward realized he had completely underestimated Sarah's reaction. He had imagined she would be grateful, perhaps even moved by the revelation. Sarah, he tried one last time, I understand your anger. I realize I approached this the wrong way, but please don't let this destroy the opportunity you have here. This clinic needs you. The patients benefit from your work. No, she cut him off, heading for the door. I'm not going to accept this farce anymore. I'm not going to continue being the charity project of a guilty millionaire. Edward followed her. Sarah, wait! Where are you going? She stopped at the door, turning to face him one last time. Her green eyes shone with unshed tears and a fierce determination that he was beginning to recognize as a fundamental trait of her personality. I'm going home, she said. I'm going to hug my kids and find a real job. A job I deserve, not one that is the result of a stranger's guilt. And with those words, Sarah Johnson left the Hope Clinic, leaving Edward alone in the office that smelled of eucalyptus, with the devastating certainty that he had lost the only person who truly mattered in his life, even before he had the chance to truly win her over. Carol's house in Springfield had never seemed so small as it did that Friday night. Sarah arrived from the clinic with red eyes and an expression that her sister immediately recognized as the harbinger of an emotional storm. Luke and Isabella were in the living room doing homework while watching television, and Carol's 2 children, Michael, 8, and Sophie, 6, were playing on the floor with Lego pieces scattered everywhere. Kids, go play in the backyard, Carol said as soon as she saw the expression on her sister's face. Aunt Sarah needs to rest. When they were alone in the kitchen, Sarah finally broke down. She sat at the yellow Formica table that Carol had bought on clearance years ago and began to cry, not the contained, silent sobs that had become her pattern since the dismissal, but deep wails that seemed to come from the depths of her soul. "Murray, what happened?" Carol asked, sitting next to her sister and placing a comforting hand on her shoulders. At 42, Carol had always been the more pragmatic sister, the one who solved problems, while Sarah dreamed of ideal solutions. "I thought you were enjoying the new job." "It was all a lie, Carol," Sarah managed to say between sobs. "Everything. The job, the casual meeting, the selfless help, everything." For the next 40 minutes, Sarah told the whole story, from the day she saved Edward to the devastating revelation at the clinic. Carol listened in silence, occasionally asking questions to clarify details, but mostly offering the silent support that Sarah needed at that moment. "Let me see if I got this straight," Carol said when Sarah finished speaking. "You saved the life of a rich man, got fired because of it. He sought you out for weeks, bought a clinic to give you a job, and you're mad because he did that?" Sarah looked at her sister incredulously. "Carol, he deceived me. He made me believe I was getting that job on my own merit." "And you weren't?" Carol asked, getting up to prepare tea. "Murray, from what you told me, you worked really well at that clinic. The patients liked you. The doctor was impressed with your competence. But the job only existed because he created the opportunity," Sarah protested. "It wasn't a real achievement." Carol placed the kettle on the stove and turned to face her sister. "Sarah Johnson, you are one of the most stubborn people I know. And sometimes that stubbornness blinds you to obvious things." "What do you mean?" "What do you mean?" Carol repeated, crossing her arms. "A millionaire fell in love with you enough to buy an entire clinic just to get to know you better, and you're complaining that he wasn't honest about his intentions." Sarah fell silent for a moment, processing her sister's words. "He didn't say he was in love." "Men don't buy clinics out of gratitude, Mari," Carol chuckled softly. "They send flowers, maybe a fancy gift. But buying an entire business, that's the act of a man in love." The kettle began to whistle, and Carol prepared the chamomile tea she always made when one of them was going through tough times. The familiar aroma brought back memories of childhood when they shared secrets and plans in their mother's kitchen. "Even if that's true," Sarah finally said, "he deceived me from the very first moment. How can I trust someone like that?" "How can you not trust?" Carol countered. "Mari, think about it. How many rich men do you know who would bother to investigate a woman's life just to make sure she was okay? How many would feel responsible for the consequences of an act of kindness?" Sarah took a sip of the hot tea, feeling the liquid slide down her throat and bringing some comfort to the turmoil of emotions in her chest. "I don't know how to deal with this, Carol," she admitted. "I've spent so long being independent, fighting not to depend on anyone after the divorce. And now this man shows up wanting to solve all my problems, and I don't know if it's love or pity." "Why can't it be both?" Carol asked gently. "Why do love and compassion have to be separate things?" "Separated?" Before Sarah could respond, Luke entered the kitchen. The teenager had visibly grown in the last few months, not only physically, but also in emotional maturity. The family's financial crisis had forced him to leave childhood behind sooner than he should have. "Mom," he said, sitting down at the table with them, "I need to tell you something." Sarah looked at her son apprehensively. "What is it, my love?" "I got the scholarship for the technical course in computer science," Luke said, trying to control the emotion in his voice. "It's full tuition, and they're also going to help me get a paid internship on weekends." Sarah felt a mix of pride and sadness. Pride in her son's determination and competence. Sadness, knowing he was taking on responsibilities that shouldn't be his. "Luke, that's wonderful," she said, hugging him. "But are you sure you want to work on weekends? You're still very young." "Mom," Luke gently interrupted her, "I want to help. We're a family, and families help each other. What that man did, maybe it wasn't the most honest way, but at least he tried to help too." Sarah looked at her son in surprise. "Did you hear our conversation?" "Part of it," he admitted. "And look, I understand why you were upset. But, Mom, you saved his life. If I were him, I would do anything to give back too. Carol smiled at her nephew. See, even a teenager understands better than you do. Sarah sighed, feeling torn between her justified indignation and the seemingly simple logic that both Carol and Luke presented. It's not that simple, she murmured. Maybe it is exactly that simple, said a voice from the kitchen door. It was Isabella who had approached silently. Mom, you always taught us that we should accept help when it's offered with good intentions. Why would this be different? Sarah looked at the three faces watching her expectantly. Her sister, her two children, and realized she was being confronted not only with her own insecurities, but with a completely different perspective on the situation. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Edward was in his penthouse apartment in Maplewood, a 3,200-square-foot space decorated by a famous designer. But that night, it felt empty and lifeless. He had dismissed the housekeeper earlier and was now alone, sitting on his balcony overlooking the Chicago skyline, trying to understand where he had gone wrong. Mark Anthony had called 3 times, wanting to know the details of the meeting at the clinic, but Edward didn't have the energy to explain the disaster that afternoon had been. Instead, he was rethinking every word, every decision he had made since the day he woke up from the coma. Maybe Sarah was right. Maybe he had truly been manipulative, selfish in his approach. He had only thought of his own need for gratitude and redemption, without considering how she would feel discovering the truth. His phone rang again, probably Mark Anthony. But when he looked at the screen, he saw an unfamiliar number. "Hello?" he answered. "Mr. Miller?" said a young female voice. "This is Isabella Johnson, Sarah's daughter." Edward straightened up immediately. "Isabella? How did you get my number?" "My mom left the business card you gave her in her purse," the teenager explained. "Listen, I know she was upset today, but could you talk to her one more time?" Edward felt a spark of hope ignite in his chest. "Isabella, I don't know if your mom would want you calling me." "My mom doesn't know I'm calling," Isabella admitted. "But I think you two are being silly. You like her, don't you? And she, well, she was more angry than sad. And my mom only gets like that when something really matters to her." Edward smiled for the first time since leaving the clinic. "Do you think she would give me a second chance?" "I think you should try," Isabella said. "But this time be completely honest. My mom hates lies, but she forgives almost anything if the person is sincere." After hanging up the phone, Edward stayed on the balcony for another hour, carefully planning his next approach. This time, there would be no manipulations, no forged coincidences or half-truths. This time, he would lay his heart completely open and let Sarah decide if there was space in her life for a man who had made mistakes but was genuinely in love with her. The second chance Isabella had suggested would also be his last chance to win the heart of the woman who had saved much more than his life. She had saved his ability to truly love for the first time. Sunday dawned sunny in Springfield, a stark contrast to the turbulent emotional state Sarah had been carrying since the revelation at the clinic. She had spent the entire weekend in reflection, alternating between serious conversations with Carol and moments of contemplative silence in the small backyard of the house, where she tried to organize her thoughts while watching the children play. At 10 in the morning, when Sarah was helping Carol prepare Sunday lunch, the front doorbell rang. Luke went to answer and returned with a curious expression on his face. "Mom," he said, "there's a man outside who wants to talk to you." He said his name is Edward. Sarah felt a knot in her stomach. She looked at Carol, who made a discreet gesture encouraging her to see him. She dried her hands on a dish towel and walked to the front door, where she found Edward standing outside the low iron gate, dressed deliberately casually, jeans, a white t-shirt, and sneakers, in a clear attempt to seem less intimidating. "Sarah," he said as soon as she appeared, "thank you for agreeing to see me." "I didn't say I agreed," she replied, keeping the door slightly ajar. "What do you want?" Edward took a deep breath. He had rehearsed that conversation in his mind all night, but now, standing in front of her, all the prepared words felt inadequate. "I want to apologize," he said simply. "And I want to be completely honest with you for the first time since we met." Sarah hesitated for a moment, studying his expression. There was something different about Edward that Sunday, a vulnerability she hadn't seen before, a genuine anxiety that contrasted with the calculated confidence of their previous encounters. "5 minutes," she finally said, opening the gate. "But let's talk here in the backyard. I don't want the kids to hear." They sat in 2 white plastic chairs under the shade of a tree that Carol had planted when she moved into the house. The setting was simple, almost modest compared to the sophisticated places where Edward usually held his important meetings. But there was something in the simplicity of that backyard that made him feel more connected to his own humanity. "Sarah," Edward began, "I want you to know that everything I did was wrong in form, but right in intention." "Explain that," she said, crossing her arms. "When I woke up from the coma and found out that a woman had saved me, my first reaction was pure gratitude. But when I learned that you had been fired because of it, that you were struggling financially for helping me, that gratitude turned into something much more complex." Edward paused, carefully choosing his next words. "It wasn't just guilt, Sarah. It was admiration. It was fascination. It was the first time in my life that I met someone capable of sacrificing their own well-being for a complete stranger." Sarah watched him in silence, her expression still cautious, but no longer hostile. "I could have just sent you money," Edward continued. "I could have had my lawyer resolve your financial difficulties anonymously. But I wanted to meet you. I wanted to understand what kind of person you were. And that's why you lied about who you were? And that's why I was cowardly," Edward admitted. "I was afraid that if you knew the truth from the beginning, you would see me as just another rich guy trying to buy your gratitude. I was afraid you would reject any approach." Sarah remained silent for a few moments, watching the kids playing in the neighboring yard. The sound of their laughter created a curiously comforting soundtrack for that tense conversation. "Edward," she finally said, "the problem isn't that you have money or that you wanted to help me. The problem is that you took away my right to choose." "What do you mean?" "When you staged that meeting at the diner, when you made up the story that you could refer me for jobs, you took away my ability to consciously decide whether I wanted your help or not." Sarah's voice was firm, but not aggressive. "You turned me into a puppet of your own redemption narrative." Edward felt the weight of that accusation like a punch in the stomach. "You're right," he admitted. "I was selfish. I only thought about how I felt, not about how you would feel." "And now?" Sarah asked. "What do you want from me now?" Edward looked her directly in the eyes, gathering all the courage he had built up over 30 years of building his business empire. "Now I want a real chance," he said. "Not as the rich man who can solve your problems, not as someone you owe something to. I want a chance as Edward, the man who fell in love with you during those 3 weeks of conversations at the diner." Sarah felt her heart race. "In love?" "Completely," Edward confirmed. "For your intelligence, for your strength, for the way you talk about your kids, for the way you treat people with respect, regardless of who they are." Before Sarah could respond, Isabella appeared at the back door of the house. "Mom," the teenager said, pretending not to notice the tension in the air, "Aunt Carol wants to know if your friend is staying for lunch." Sarah looked at Edward, who smiled shyly. "I don't want to intrude on the family gathering." "Actually," Sarah said, surprised by her own words, "maybe it's a good idea. If you really want a real chance, you should properly meet my kids." Lunch was a revealing experience for Edward. The small kitchen table, which barely accommodated 6 people, was filled with simple yet tasty food: roasted chicken, rice, baked beans, cornbread, and a salad of lettuce and tomato. The conversation flowed naturally, with Luke asking insightful questions about Edward's business, Isabella sharing her dreams of becoming a dancer, and the younger kids filling the atmosphere with their innocent antics. Edward realized that he hadn't participated in such a genuinely welcoming meal in years. In his corporate world, lunches were disguised meetings, dinners were networking opportunities, and there was rarely space for spontaneous conversations and genuine laughter. "Edward," Carol said during dessert, a chocolate cake she had prepared the night before, "Sarah told us you have a network of hospitals. That must be a very stressful job." "It is," Edward admitted, "especially because I try to maintain the quality of care without making services inaccessible to the middle class. It's a difficult balance." Luke immediately became interested. "What do you mean? Don't you charge what you want?" Edward smiled, appreciating the teenager's genuine curiosity. "Actually, Luke, the American healthcare system is very complex. We have to balance financial sustainability with social responsibility. It's not always easy." The conversation extended for another hour, and Sarah watched Edward interacting with her family with a mix of surprise and admiration. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He wasn't flaunting his wealth or importance. He was simply being himself, intelligent, thoughtful, genuinely interested in the people around him. When it was time for him to leave, Edward said goodbye to everyone individually, thanking them for their hospitality and complimenting Carol's cooking. At the front door, Sarah walked him to the car, a discreet black sedan, very different from the luxury cars she had seen him drive before. "I imagined he would drive," said Edward, standing next to the car. "Thank you for allowing me to meet your family, for giving me a chance to show who I really am." "I'm still processing everything," Sarah said honestly. "But it was nice to see you interacting with the people who matter most to me," Edward nodded. "Sarah, I would like to make a proposal." "What kind of proposal?" "Let me court you properly. No lies, no manipulation, no using my money as a shortcut. Just you and me getting to know each other like normal people do." Sarah considered the proposal for a moment. "And the clinic?" "The clinic remains yours if you want it. But now you know the truth about its origin. The decision is entirely yours." Edward paused. "But regardless of your decision about the job, I would like to invite you to dinner with me tomorrow night. A real date where you can ask any questions you want, and I promise to answer with complete honesty." Sarah felt torn between caution and curiosity. There was something about Edward that attracted her, and it wasn't just gratitude or admiration for him trying to help her. It was something deeper, a genuine connection she had felt even when she didn't know who he really was. "All right," she finally said. "A dinner. But I choose the restaurant, and nothing too expensive or extravagant." Edward smiled, and for the first time since she met him, the smile seemed completely natural and unpretentious. "Perfect," he said. "You set the rules. I just promised to be myself." As Edward walked away, Sarah stood on the sidewalk, watching the car disappear around the corner. For the first time in months, she felt truly hopeful about the future, not just about her romantic prospects, but about her own ability to make conscious and informed decisions about her life. What she didn't know was that Henry Smith, the supervisor who had fired her from the city medical center, had discovered her new job and was planning a revenge that would threaten not only her new professional stability, but also her growing trust in Edward. The second chance was just beginning, but the complications to come would test both Edward's sincerity and Sarah's character strength in ways neither could anticipate. Henry Smith was sitting in his office at the City Medical Center on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, flipping through financial reports with the same sour expression that had become his trademark in recent months. Since Sarah's dismissal, the atmosphere at the clinic had changed subtly but noticeably. The other staff members worked with less enthusiasm, patients complained more frequently about the service, and even Dr. Silver, the owner, had made comments about the decline in the quality of the work environment. What irritated Henry the most, however, was the persistent feeling that he had made a strategic mistake. Sarah Johnson had been fired in a moment of anger and power play, but her absence was proving more problematic than he had anticipated. The new receptionist, a 22-year-old with no experience in the medical field, was making constant mistakes that resulted in rework and complaints. It was when Patricia, one of the nursing technicians at the clinic, casually mentioned during the coffee break that she had seen Sarah working at a new clinic in Springfield, that Henry felt a spark of malicious curiosity ignite in his chest. "Hope Clinic," Patricia said, stirring sugar into her coffee cup. "My cousin lives in the area and said Sarah is working there as a supervisor. It seems she's even earning more than she did here." Henry feigned disinterest, but inside his mind was already working. How had a woman fired for cause managed to land a supervisory position in such a short time? There was something strange about this story, and Henry Smith hadn't gotten to where he was by ignoring details that didn't add up. That same afternoon, he made a few calls to contacts in the medical field in Springfield. The area was small, and information about new establishments circulated quickly among professionals. That's how he discovered that the Hope Clinic had recently been acquired by a business group linked to Edward Miller's hospital network. The name Edward Miller triggered a specific memory in Henry. 2 weeks after firing Sarah, he had read in the business news about a health entrepreneur who had suffered a heart attack in downtown Chicago. The article mentioned that the executive had been saved by a person who preferred to remain anonymous, who provided first aid at the scene. Henry was not a stupid man. His ambition had been built on a keen ability to connect seemingly unrelated information. The date of the heart attack, the area where it happened, the fact that Sarah had arrived late to work that same day, claiming to have helped someone who had fallen ill. He picked up the phone and called Mark Vincent, a private investigator he had previously used to check the backgrounds of employees in delicate situations. "Mark," Henry said when the investigator answered, "I need a discreet investigation on a former employee of mine. Sarah Johnson. I want to know exactly how she got her current job and what her relationship is with Edward Miller." 3 days later, Mark Vincent returned with information that exceeded Henry's most ambitious expectations. Not only had Sarah saved Edward Miller, but the entrepreneur had bought the Hope Clinic specifically to employ her. There were photographs of Edward visiting Sarah's home in Springfield, evidence that they had met multiple times before her hiring. Henry smiled for the first time in weeks. He had in his hands exactly the kind of information he could use to restore his own prestige at the City Medical Center while simultaneously destroying the new life Sarah had built. On Friday morning, Henry scheduled a meeting with Dr. Silver, the owner of the City Medical Center. Robert Silver was a cardiologist. It had been 65 years since he founded the clinic 30 years earlier, and he had always prioritized the ethical reputation of the establishment over immediate profits. "Dr. Silver," began Henry, spreading documents and photographs across the table, "I need to inform you about a situation that could compromise our clinic's reputation." Dr. Silver, who had never fully liked Henry's authoritarian methods, examined the materials with growing skepticism. "What is it about, Henry?" "About the dismissal of Sarah Johnson," said Henry, trying to maintain a professional tone. "I discovered that she was involved in a situation of nepotism and favoritism that could have legal implications for our clinic if we hadn't acted." Henry then recounted his distorted version of the facts. Sarah had deliberately delayed meeting Edward Miller, had faked the medical incident to create a situation that allowed her to get close to a wealthy businessman, and had used her position at the clinic to obtain privileged information about medical procedures that she later used to impress her future employer. Dr. Silver listened with an increasingly grim expression, not because he believed Henry's accusations, but because he was beginning to understand the kind of man he had hired as the administrative supervisor. "Henry," Dr. Silver said when the supervisor finished his presentation, "these are very serious accusations. Do you have concrete evidence that Sarah Johnson acted unethically?" "Doctor, the evidence speaks for itself," Henry replied, pointing to the photographs. "A woman dismissed for just cause gets a better job within weeks with the same man she claimed to have helped on the day of the delay. The coincidence is impossible." Dr. Silver studied the images for a few minutes. There were indeed photographs of Edward visiting Sarah, of seemingly intimate conversations between them, of a relationship that clearly transcended the professional. "What do you propose we do?" Dr. Silver asked. "I propose that we inform the competent authorities about the possible fraud," Henry said, barely able to contain his satisfaction. "And I suggest we send a formal letter to Hope Clinic informing them about Sarah Johnson's problematic background. It is our ethical duty to protect other establishments from employees with questionable conduct." Dr. Silver remained silent for several minutes. Finally, he stood up and walked to the window of his office, observing the street traffic below. "Henry," he said without turning around, "Sarah Johnson worked at this clinic for 5 years without a single formal complaint. Her professional record is impeccable. Her colleagues respected her, and patients often praised her care. People with ulterior motives can be very convincing, and people motivated by personal revenge can be very destructive." Dr. Silver turned to face Henry directly. "Do you really believe the accusations you are making, or are you using information obtained through private investigation to pursue a former employee?" Henry felt the ground becoming unstable beneath his feet. "You hired a private investigator to spy on Sarah Johnson." Dr. Silver pointed to the documents. "These photographs were obtained without her knowledge. This information was collected through questionable methods. And now you want me to use this material to destroy the professional life of a woman you dismissed in a moment of anger." The room fell silent for almost a minute. Henry realized he had completely underestimated Dr. Silver's reaction. "Henry," the doctor finally said, "you are fired for just cause. Misuse of company resources for personal revenge, harassment of former employees, and conduct incompatible with the ethical values of this institution." "Dr. Silver, you can't." "I can and I am," Dr. Silver interrupted. "I want you out of this clinic today, and if I find out that you tried to use this information to harm Sarah Johnson in any way, I will sue you for defamation and harassment." Henry left the City Medical Center that afternoon, carrying a box with his personal belongings and a rage that burned like acid in his veins. The humiliation of being publicly fired in front of the same employees he had intimidated for 2 years was almost unbearable. But Henry Johnson was not the type of man to accept defeat quietly. If he couldn't use official channels to destroy Sarah, he would find other means. That very night, he called 3 tabloid journalists specializing in scandals involving public figures. The story he told was an even more distorted version of the facts. A nurse who had used privileged information to seduce a millionaire businessman. A case of financial interest disguised as romance. A woman who had manipulated a medical situation for her own benefit. "Imagine the headline," Henry said to the 3rd journalist he contacted. "The Nurse and the Millionaire, Romance or Gold Digger?" The journalist, an expert at creating controversies where none existed, smiled on the other end of the line. "Send me the photos and the details. If the story is good, we can publish it in the Sunday edition." Henry hung up the phone with a cruel smile. If Sarah Johnson thought she had won, she was about to discover that some battles had far more lasting consequences than she imagined. What Henry didn't know was that Dr. Silver, driven by guilt for hiring such a vindictive man, had already called Edward Miller to warn him about the possible retaliation Sarah might face. The war that Henry had declared was about to begin, but he would find that he had underestimated not only Sarah's strength of character, but also the determination of a passionate man willing to protect the woman he loved at any cost. Sunday dawned with a light rain that left Chicago with that typical melancholic autumn air. Sarah was in Carol's kitchen preparing coffee when her cell phone rang. It was Dr. Silver from the City Medical Center, calling at an unusual hour for professional matters. "Sarah," said the familiar voice of the cardiologist, "I'm sorry to bother you on a Sunday, but I need to alert you about an urgent situation. In the next 15 minutes, Dr. Silver told her the whole story, Henry's investigation, his attempts to defame her, Marina's termination for just cause, and the possible contacts with sensationalist media. Sarah listened in growing silence, feeling a mix of indignation and fear forming in her stomach. "Dr. Silver," she said when he finished, "thank you for letting me know. But why are you doing this?" "Because in 5 years working here, you have never given me a single reason to doubt your character," the doctor replied. "And because I hired Henry Smith thinking he was just strict, when in fact he is a dangerous man driven by personal vengeance." After hanging up, Sarah stood in the kitchen, absorbing the implications of what she had heard. Luke, who had overheard part of the conversation, approached with a worried expression. "Mum, what happened? Is everything okay?" Before Sarah could respond, the doorbell rang. It was Edward, arriving promptly for the Sunday lunch they had arranged the night before, after a dinner that had been simultaneously the most honest and romantic conversation Sarah had had in years. "Edward," she said as she opened the door, "we need to talk urgently." They sat in the living room, where Sarah recounted the entire conversation with Dr. Silver. Edward listened with an expression that gradually transformed from concern to controlled fury. "That bastard," Edward murmured when she finished. "Sarah, I suspected something like this could happen. That's why I hired a security firm to monitor any attempts at harassment or defamation against you." "You did what?" Sarah stared at him with a mix of surprise and irritation. "Edward, you can't make that kind of decision without consulting me." "You're right," he admitted. Immediately. "But Sarah, I know men like Henry Smith. They don't accept defeat, and when they feel humiliated, they can become dangerous." As if the universe were orchestrating a dramatic confirmation of Edward's words, Sarah's phone rang again. It was an unknown number. "Hello? Sarah Johnson?" asked a male voice she didn't recognize. "Yes, who is this?" "This is Robert Johnson from City Spotlight. I'm doing a piece on opportunistic relationships in high society, and your name was mentioned as someone who may have become romantically involved with Edward Miller after saving him from a heart attack. I would like to hear your version of the facts." Sarah felt the blood freeze in her veins. "I have nothing to declare," she said, hanging up immediately. Edward, who had heard the conversation, grabbed his own phone and dialed quickly. "Mark," he said when someone answered, "the situation we discussed is happening now. Activate the protocol we prepared." "Edward," Sarah interrupted, "what protocol? What are you talking about?" Edward sighed, realizing once again he was making decisions without consulting her. "Sarah, when Dr. Silver called me last night to warn me about Henry, I anticipated he would try to use the press against us. My lawyer has already prepared preventive legal measures against defamation, and my public relations team is ready to respond to any biased articles." "Your public relations team?" Sarah stood up, nervously pacing the room. "Edward, you've turned my life into a corporate chess game." "No!" He stood up too, walking towards her. "I'm trying to protect you." "Protect?" Sarah turned to face him, her green eyes shining with a mix of tears and indignation. "Edward, you don't understand. I don't want to be protected. I want to be respected. I want to be consulted before decisions are made about my life." Luke, who was in the kitchen with Isabella and Carol's children, appeared at the entrance of the living room. "Mom, is everything okay? You guys are shouting." Sarah and Edward looked at each other, realizing that the discussion had escalated beyond what they intended. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to compose herself. "It's fine, sweetheart," she said to Luke. "It's just an adult conversation." Edward slowly approached Sarah, his hands extended in a gesture of peace. "Sarah, you are absolutely right. I'm doing again exactly what I promised I wouldn't do anymore, making decisions for you, treating you like someone who needs to be saved instead of someone who deserves to be consulted." Sarah studied him for a moment, seeing the genuine sincerity in his eyes. "Edward, I understand that you want to help me. I even understand that you have the resources and experience to deal with situations like this. But if we are going to have a real chance of making this work, you need to understand that I am your partner, not your project." "You're right," Edward said, sitting on the sofa and running his hands through his hair. "Sarah, I spent 30 years solving problems with money and power. It's hard for me to understand that sometimes the best solution is simply talking. Sarah sat down next to him, but maintaining a physical distance that reflected the emotional distance she still felt. Edward, what really bothers me is not that you want to help me. It's you deciding how to help me without asking how I would like to be helped. Edward turned to look at her directly. What would you like me to do differently? I would like you to ask me, Sarah, how can we face this together? And instead of coming in with ready-made solutions, she replied, I would like you to trust my ability to make decisions about my own life. At that moment, Sarah's phone rang again. This time, she looked at Edward before answering. It's another journalist, she said, checking the unknown number. How do you want to handle this? Edward asked, and Sarah immediately noticed the difference in his approach. I want to answer and give my version of the facts, she said. But I would like you to be here by my side when I do. Edward smiled, the first genuine smile since the tension had begun. It would be an honor. Sarah answered the phone and put it on speaker. It was another journalist, this time from a sensationalist television program, asking the same insinuating questions about her relationship with Edward. Look, Sarah said, her voice clear and firm, I will clarify the facts. 3 months ago, I saved the life of a man who was having a heart attack on the street. I was fired from my job because I was late due to that incident. This man later sought me out to thank me, and yes, we developed feelings for each other. There is nothing unethical, illegal, or morally questionable in this story. But, ma'am, the journalist insisted, the fact that he bought a clinic to employ you doesn't suggest. It suggests that he is a generous man who felt responsible for the consequences of my act of kindness. Sarah interrupted him. And it suggests that we live in a society where generosity is viewed with suspicion, where an act of love is interpreted as financial interest. Edward watched her with growing admiration. Sarah was handling the situation with more elegance and effectiveness than any public relations team could achieve. Moreover, Sarah continued, any insinuation that my behavior was unethical or self-serving will be treated legally as defamation. I have 5 years of impeccable work in the medical field, witnesses to the situation that led to my unjust dismissal, and complete documentation of all the facts mentioned. After hanging up, Sarah looked at Edward with a combative satisfaction that he had never seen before. How was that? He asked. It was liberating, she replied. For the first time since all this started, I feel like I'm controlling my own narrative. Edward moved closer to her on the couch. Sarah, can I ask you a question? Of course. Would you forgive me one more time if I said that I am completely in love with you and would like to know if you would accept my marriage proposal? Sarah was silent for so long that Edward began to worry. Finally, she spoke. Edward, that is a very important question to ask in the middle of a crisis. Ask me again when we are in a moment of peace. When I can be sure that you are proposing because you want to build a life with me, not because you want to protect me from the world? Edward smiled, fully understanding what she meant. When this whole confusion passes, I will ask again. But I can already tell you that the answer will be about building a life together, not about protecting you. In that case, Sarah said, smiling for the first time that tense Sunday, I can already hint that my answer will probably be yes. 6 months later, Edward asked the question again. This time, they were on the same sidewalk where Sarah had saved him. But now, the location had been transformed into a small public garden that they had funded together, a symbol of how something traumatic could be turned into something beautiful. Sarah's answer was exactly what she had promised. Dr. Henry Smith never managed to publish his defamatory story. Dr. Silva had alerted all serious outlets about the vindictive motivations behind the accusations, and the tabloids lost interest when Sarah handled the situation so transparently and with dignity. 2 years later, Sarah and Edward inaugurated the Sarah Johnson Community Medical Center, a project that combined free medical care for the underprivileged with professional training programs in the healthcare field. In her inauguration speech, Sarah said, "This center represents everything I believe in, that kindness begets kindness, that helping others is the truest way to help oneself, and that the best relationships are built when two people decide to face the world together as equal partners." Edward, standing beside her on the podium, smiled, knowing he had found not just a wife, but a true life companion who had taught him that true love is not about protecting or being protected, but about growing together as better individuals.